10 or 12 years ago, I was at the eye doctor with a friend of mine. He was just getting his eyes checked and getting his prescription for his glasses changed. And before we left, I asked the lady behind the counter if there was anything I could pray for her about. I'm kind of in the habit of doing that with strangers fairly often. And said, is there anything I can pray for you about? And she immediately got teary-eyed. And she said, yes, please pray for me. And I said, well, what's going on? And she said, I can't handle it anymore. And she told me her story. She had been married for 25 years. Love of her life. I mean, they were high school sweethearts, passionately in love. Just apparently had a wonderful relationship their whole marriage. And she went to bed one night, and she had a clock like this. She had a battery-powered clock. And she told her husband before they went to bed, this was about 10 o'clock at night, said, I think my batteries are dying. And she said, because the clock has been slowing down. So if I don't get up in time for work, make sure and get me up in the morning. And they took the batteries out, and they looked all through the house and couldn't find any batteries. And so they put them back in and set the alarm and went to bed. And in the middle of the night, there was pounding on the door of her house. And she woke up, and her husband wasn't there. And she went to answer the door, and there were police officers there. And her husband, in the middle of the night, it was about 2 in the morning, had been hit by a drunk driver and killed. They had tried to rescue him with the jaws of life. It took him about a half an hour, 45 minutes just to get the car open enough to get him out. And by that time, he was gone. And she was just devastated and went home and found that the back of that clock had been reopened and those batteries taken out, and he had taken them with him. So he had gotten up in the middle of the night to go get her batteries for her clock and had been in this terrible wreck and ended his life. And she said it 2 or 3 times. She said, I'm so lonely. She said, I just never knew what it was like to be lonely, just cried. Said, I'm so lonely. Now, I was able to pray with her and try to give her some words of comfort, but in a situation like that, they were God-fearing, God-believing, God-loving people. They had been churchgoers and Christians for the entire life of their marriage. And it's unavoidable that you don't ask the question, where was God? I mean, come on, these are people that had prayed. Surely at some point she had prayed, keep my husband safe, right? Surely they had prayed together about their protection and safety. Surely couldn't God have woken him up 30 seconds earlier or 30 seconds later? And if he had, wouldn't he still be alive today? It's an important question. Where is God in suffering? I want to show you a couple memes from atheists online that will kind of summarize the argument concerning suffering. And I'll just let you absorb this for just a second. We see it and we think, oh, you're a bad person for even bringing that to my attention. We need to look at a picture like that. We need to think about that. Or how about this one? This one's rough. This is from an atheist that draws really awful cartoons about Jesus. But this one's poignant. It makes you think. But do you see the heart behind the cartoon? Where is God? Where is Jesus when a mother watches her child die from leukemia? Surely he could have set up a world without leukemia, right? He can do anything. He's all loving. He's all powerful. Couldn't he have done that? Why didn't he do that? He couldn't exist. The God the Christians say is there couldn't possibly exist. This is how they say it in semi-formal language. They'll say, if God is all-powerful, he can stop suffering. This premise is true. If he's all-powerful, he can stop suffering, right? 2, if he's all good, he wants to stop suffering. A good God would want to help people and make them not hurt, right? 3, suffering does exist, and therefore, an all-powerful, all-good God does not exist. This is how the argument goes. Before I dive into the argument, and before we start to talk about the rational explanations concerning suffering, I want to tell you a story. I was in Murray, Kentucky at our little brick home. It was the first home we owned after we were married. And I was sitting out on the porch reading the Bible one day. And the mailman comes by and drops the mail in the slot. And I said, and I'm always looking for an opportunity to talk to people. So I said, hey man, how you doing? He said, good. I said, look, I'm reading the Bible here and I came to this passage and I'm wondering what you think it means. said, all right. So he comes over and he looks over my shoulder, and I don't even remember what the passage was. It was something about Jesus. And he said, well, I think it means this, this, and this. I said, that's what I was thinking it probably meant. And I shook his hand and introduced myself, and I said, I asked him if he had a spiritual background, a church background of some sort. He said, well, yeah. And he said, I just don't go to church much anymore. He actually put his bag down and sat down on the porch with me. It's real, if you'll talk to people, they'll talk to you. Okay, this is something we'll learn. But he sat down, put his bag down, and started talking. I said, well, how come you don't go anymore? He said, he said, I've seen too much. And I said, like what? And he said, just bad stuff. I've seen really, really bad stuff. Bad things happen to good people. And he said, I don't see how there could be a God with all the bad things that I've seen. And so I went into my intellectual diatribe of 4 points and said, hey, well, have you considered this? And 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 it's a pretty solid case for suffering in Christianity. And the whole time he nodded and smiled, and he said, hey, I appreciate the conversation, but I got to get back on my route. We'll talk later. And I said, okay. So he gets up and he goes and delivers the mail. And afterwards, I just thought, H, you are such a bonehead. I talk to myself in the third person pretty often. I said, H, you're a bonehead. And I thought, and it was just real obvious that that's not what he needed. It wasn't what he was looking for. And so I thought about that because he was a guest, a fill-in postal worker. He wasn't the normal mailman. So I didn't see him for weeks. Weeks later, he comes back, and I'm in the house, and I see him approaching. So I run outside, and I say, hey, how you doing? And called him by name. And I said, you remember when we talked on the porch out here that day? He said, yeah, I remember that. And I said, well, you told me that you had seen a lot of awful things. And I said, and I gave you 4 points, to show why God is allowed to cause suffering or allowed to allow suffering. And I said, I just felt really stupid after that. And I said, I just felt like that's not what you needed at all. And I just want to say I'm sorry for that. I said, and I'm sorry for what you went through. I said, I don't know what you've gone through, but I know it hurt, and I just want to say I'm sorry for that, and I wish it didn't hurt as bad. And he sat down again, put his bag down, and then he told me the story. It was an awful story. It was a very painful story. And it was an emotional connecting time between the two of us, and it felt like some real ministry happened. And so I say all that to say there's 2 ways you can approach the issue of suffering, and neither are adequate. We're going to talk about the intellectual case for suffering today, but understand that that's not the answer for everyone. And when you encounter suffering, a lot of times what people need is just a shoulder to cry on, just an ear to hear. Okay? So there's 2 ways to approach it. One is the intellectual way, the book smart way you get in the books, and the other way is the emotional way and just dealing with people's emotions. Just be aware of that. So when I talk about the intellectual parts of the argumentation, don't let that mean that we don't care about suffering. Because we do. We deeply care, and we believe that God deeply cares. But we're going to get into the intellectual argumentation. So one of the statements in the argument says if God is all-powerful, He can stop suffering, right? Here's a decent response to that. That is, not if all-powerful equals able to do all that can actually be done. When we say God is omnipotent, all-powerful, it means He has all power to accomplish all things that can be done. But there are some things that just logically cannot be done, even by an omnipotent being. Here's an example. Can God create a square circle? Just by definition, He cannot. Now, maybe out in His multi-dimensional existence, there's some way to twist the words and make the words mean different things, but there are some things that just cannot logically be accomplished. They cannot be. It has nothing to do with power, it has to do with logic and nonsense. Some things are just nonsense. There's no such thing as a square circle. And I'm going to argue that there's no such thing as a world with natural laws and sentient beings, that's thinking, feeling beings, where suffering of some form doesn't exist. Okay? There is no conceivable world with music where there isn't some form of relative suffering. Even by definition, when you consider what music is, if it's a collection of sounds or a collection of notes that are either pleasant or unpleasant, right then, built into what music is this relative suffering. And there's no getting away from it. In a world with natural law and sentient beings, there's no getting away from the concept of suffering. So let's say that her music, well, we'll just hypothetical. Some of you may have hated it. You may hate opera. You may hate Les Mis. But let's say her music was an 8 out of 10 on the scale, and his was a 2 out of 10 on the scale. There's no universe where there's music where there isn't such a scale. If all music was an 8, it wouldn't be music. Nobody would ever stand up and applaud and scream and yell, and there would never be a victorious moment in the arts. In a world with the arts, there will always be relative suffering. In a world with sunsets. Now, this is a beautiful sunset, right? We can pretty much agree that's a beautiful sunset. But we can only say it's beautiful because we have something to compare it to. We suffer through this sunset, and we rejoice in the prior sunset. In a world with beauty and color, that's what the first movie clip from The Giver gets at, is in a world with no color, you really limit suffering. But who wants to live in a world with no color? Food. There's good food, and there's bad food. There's food you want to eat, and there's food you don't want to eat. In a world where there is with the word delicious, there must be some kind of relative suffering. Now, I'm not talking about the difference between being hungry and wanting blueberries and having smallpox. We haven't gotten to that point yet. But I'm saying there is no conceivable world where there isn't some degree of suffering, even in heaven. We can talk about that later if you'd like, but I believe in heaven there will be music that's 1,000,000 on the scale, and there will be music that's 900,000 on the scale. And the reason all of it will be rejoicing and clapping and cheering is because we've experienced the 8. We've experienced the 2. I believe even in heaven there must be some kind of relative suffering. We can get into that personally if you'd like to talk about it. In a world with natural laws, there are places that are comfortable to lay your head, and there are places that are not so comfortable to lay your head. Is this true? Gravity is our friend. You see, in a world with gravity, which we would all agree is a pretty important part of physics, right? It's the reason we're not floating off into this space right now. It's a good thing, gravity. But you see, gravity could also potentially cause terrible suffering. The law of gravity could destroy you. The law of gravity can break your kneecaps. There's no world that we can see or think about or imagine that doesn't have some degree of suffering, especially a world with natural law, which is the only kind of world that we can imagine. A rock is going to be something you can build your house on. It's something you can sit on around a campfire. It's also something you can stub your toe on. The existence of a rock creates the potential for suffering. We're not talking about actualized suffering, realized suffering. We're just saying the potential is there. And there's no world with natural laws conceivable that doesn't carry that potential. So here's a good question to ask your skeptical or atheist friends that say God couldn't be because of suffering. You could say, what would the world look like without suffering? Describe it to me. And they can't. Because there's no such world conceivable by man. There's no such world where some relative suffering doesn't exist. Even when you talk about the Garden of Eden, there was relative suffering because they were hungry, so they ate. You'd say, I suffered through hunger. But it was a totally different degree of suffering than we experience now, a totally different degree of hunger. And so to me, the bottom line on suffering is that sentient beings are the foundational problem. That people are the problem. People are the cause of suffering. Greg Boyd said this. He said, if God is going to give free will to His creatures, and we'll talk about, you may immediately think, well, what about earthquakes? What about famine? We'll get to that, I promise. But I'm saying humanity is the foundation. If God is going to give free will to His creatures, He has to allow for the possibility of them misusing that freedom. Even if that means hurting others. To be significantly free is to be morally responsible. Even God couldn't have it any other way. He could not create free moral agents without risks. Love is risky. Love is always risky. Love, at its core, is risky. Let's say every morning I fed this potion to my wife. Love potion number 9. Which I kind of do just by walking in the room. But let's say I gave her some liquid every morning and it made her my dream girl. I mean, she wore her hair just like I like it, her makeup just like I like it. She walked the way I like, she talked the way I like. We made love anytime we wanted, as often as I wanted to. She cooked and cleaned and took care of the kids, and I sat and watched football and went and played golf. Is it love? If I'm giving her a chemical that makes her compliant, is it love? You see, love without a choice isn't love. No such thing. Love requires choice, or it's something else. And God created creatures capable of love because He is love. That's His core. That's the foundational truth about God, is God is love. So He created human beings to be lovers. When He created human beings to be lovers, He introduced a very dangerous situation. This is my son. He was 5 years old at this time, and he wanted to play in the mud one day. And so we said, all right, man, have at it. Go for it. He didn't keep those pants on for very long. But he went diving around in the mud and flinging mud and throwing mud, and a dog came out of the field and started licking him and playing and jumping around and dancing and water splashing everywhere. And it wasn't long until he looked like this. He was cold, miserable, and uncomfortable. It was probably in the upper 50s, low 60s that day. So he got chilled. He got mud in his eye. And it didn't take long for the situation to turn into this. Now let's say he says, I want to play in the mud. And I say, okay, you can play in the mud. Just don't get in the mud. Well, that doesn't make any sense. He says, I want to play in the mud. I want to go have a blast. I want to go have a good time. Okay, you can have a good time as long as the mud only comes up above your knee, below your knees. Don't get any mud up here. But you see, to let him be free and wild and enjoy and have a good time, I had to give him license. I had to give him the freedom to land face first in the mud and be uncomfortable. To allow him to enjoy was to allow him to take risks. And the world is no different. I told him to go get dressed one day. He said, what can I wear? And I said, whatever you want. Don't ever tell a 4-year-old wear whatever you want. This was a couple years ago. He came out, no joke, in blue jeans with basketball shorts over the blue jeans, one orange sock, one green sock pulled up over the blue jeans, and like a Batman shirt with a cape, and wanted to go to school. Now, as a father, I can say, and I did say, and I kind of regret this decision at this point because I think it's good parenting to let him make bad decisions. I said, no, that's not going to happen. I said, go get dressed. He said, I am dressed. I said, go put something on normal for school. And he came back in blue jeans and a sweater. Did he have the freedom that I said he had initially? If I said, go wear whatever you want, did he actually have the freedom to wear whatever he wanted? No. You see, freedom always requires risks. If he had the actual freedom, he can go do what he wants, even if it displeases me. Even if it turns out ugly, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it makes me look like a goofball when I drop him off at school, if he has the legitimate freedom, bad things can happen. See, Jonas learned real quick that in a world where love is unleashed, hate also comes with the territory. The potential for hate, at least, comes with the territory. And the problem is that the degree that you're capable of love, you're alternatively capable of that degree of hate. If I'm capable of loving one person, helping, serving one person, I'm capable of hurting, hating, terrorizing one person. If I have the power to love 50 people, I have the power to hurt 50 people. I have the power to at least withdraw that love and cause them suffering. And in every conceivable world where love is actualized, where it is released, somehow, some way, the opposite must be allowed. It doesn't mean it must be real or it must come to pass. The original plan was no, that it would not come to pass. But humanity had a choice. God said, go get dressed. And humanity came back dressed in their underoos, their Batman cape. And so when we think about suffering, most what we would call acute suffering, and what I mean by acute suffering is it's the difference between being hungry, you're ready to eat, and having smallpox. It's the difference between sleeping in a bed that isn't as comfortable as the bed you slept in last night, or being born with a severe disability that doesn't allow you to communicate for your entire life. And when we talk about acute suffering, the vast majority of acute suffering that ever has happened in the history of humanity could be relieved or at least vastly minimized by humanity. So take the person with a disability who's grown without the ability to communicate, for example. Isn't it true that their suffering would be diminished completely, or not completely, but diminished a lot if mankind would treat them the way they ought to be treated? If mankind was compassionate and caring and loving. Most suffering, and we'll get into the other kind of suffering next week, I promise. What about tornadoes? Mankind has nothing to do with tornadoes, we think. Okay? We'll talk about that next week. But most could be helped if humans would get on board. So you look at this situation, which has haunted our vision for the last couple weeks. Do you see that if mankind would change, this suffering would change? These Egyptian families that somebody came to their door and just dragged them out of their homes and took them to a beach nearby and killed them. Do you see if mankind was different, that suffering would be relieved? And so the second part of the argument is that if God is all good, He wants to stop suffering. And on the surface level, that seems clear that that would be the case. But you have to look at it this way, and it means not if, it's at the expense of love expressed in freedom. Love expressed in freedom is God's highest ideal. But do you see that with freedom comes risk? With freedom comes the potential for danger. So we look at these terrible pictures like this in Syria. We say, where was God? And the atheist shakes his fist at God. And a good response to that is, where was man? Where was mankind? If mankind wasn't so utterly screwed up and messed up and not thinking clearly and walking in darkness, this father would still have his son. You see, this is a mankind issue. Now, I do believe God has said, this far and no more. We'll talk about that again next week. You look at this and you say, where's God? It's easy for the atheist to say, oh, I prayed for my football game, I prayed to find my car keys, and then post up a picture of a starving child and say, where are the Christians? And you know what? It's a great question. It's something we need to think about. But do you know that this picture wouldn't exist if mankind would get their head on straight? There's enough food to go around. There's enough resources to feed everybody on the planet. It's a mankind issue. It's not a God issue. God said, go get dressed, and we came back in our ugliest suit. That's the problem. Even in suffering that is uncaused by people, it could be greatly relieved if people would get on board. Imagine if a tsunami hits and people die and families are suffering. Imagine if the world mobilized to make a difference, how different it would be. It doesn't mean the suffering wouldn't be there. And we'll talk about that next week. But what it does mean is mankind has a great power when it comes to alleviating pain. But somehow, some way, God decided that this picture was worth it. Because there's pictures like that, and then there's pictures like this. And he somehow said, love expressed in freedom, free will, moral agents that can go out and make choices themselves. He said, that is worth it. It's worth whatever level of pain occurs. It's worth whatever level of suffering happens. It's worth it to create love. It's worth it to create compassion. It's worth it to invest His mercy and His wonderment and His love and His awesomeness into sentient beings. The risk was worth it. It was a terrible risk. But it's a risk He chose because pictures like that and pictures like these are worth it. Mankind is worth it. And just, mull on this for a while. What is a kiss in a world with no suffering? Does a kiss even make sense? If there's no suffering, then what does a kiss bring? Just think about that for a little while. What is romance in a world with no suffering? What is a connection with other people in a world with no suffering? You see, there's no such conceivable world anywhere. I'm going to do my best not to cry looking at this picture. I might not even look at it with you, but in Syria, after some of the explosions, an infant was trapped in the rubble, and for hours they worked to rescue this child, maybe a year and a half old. And eventually they rescued the child. And this is a picture of him being united with his brother right afterwards. I'm not even going to look at it. This is a moment of ecstasy. It's a moment of indescribable joy when he's reunited with his little brother that he thought was lost forever. But do you see that moment of ecstasy, that moment of indescribable joy, would never have happened had they not endured the suffering and pain of the child being thought lost? It was something about him being gone and being brought back that made this moment a worth capturing in a photo and passed around the globe. One day, everything will be made right. One day you will see it was all worth it. We live in a world trapped in the rubble of a nasty explosion. We live in a world that is jacked up and messed up, and people are trying to get out and trying to climb out from under the rocks. And one day a king will come. He'll say, I'm fixing all of this, and I'm doing it right now. And it will be a moment like this multiplied by 1 billion, when everything is made right. One of my favorite authors recently said these words. He said, if a person never loved, he'd never suffer. But then again, he'd never really live. Love is everything. God is love. That's his identity. That's his personality. It's his founding characteristic. And you see that when he created someone, a being, to pour himself into, he created a dangerous creature. He created a being that could make terrible decisions. And that those terrible decisions would pile up on top of one another and bury people in them all over the globe for history, for all of history. But then this same God, at some point, is going to say, that's it, enough. He's going to clean it all up. And those who will, those who can, those who are connected with him, we can talk about that personally. I'd love to have lunch with you if you have questions about that. We'll go off into a world with color and sunsets and boats and oceans and beauty and courage. And the reason it will be so fantastic is because of the ugly that we saw, the ugly that we experienced. I know it brings up a boatload of questions, and I'm happy to answer those questions. You can text or write in questions@daylightchurch.com. We'll talk. But know this, love and suffering go hand in hand a lot of times. So there's the first part of the intellectual response is, one, God can only do what can be done. And a world with natural laws and sentient beings and no suffering does not exist. It's inconceivable. So you can ask your skeptical friends, tell me about that world, because it doesn't exist. There's no answer for them. And the second is that love expressed in free will was God's highest priority. And love expressed in free will always carries risks.